I'd like to welcome you today to this WCSS training session on wildlife management related to spills. My name is Carl Reimer, and I'm the chair for WCSS Area C. We'll have a bit more on WCSS at the end of this presentation. The importance of wildlife protection has changed significantly over the past years as it relates to spill response. In years past, wildlife was something that was dealt with if it became an issue during a spill response. Advanced planning was not always considered. If an animal was oiled, it was often euthanized. Now the importance of wildlife in a spill response is front and center. Oiled animals make the headlines, and regulators are managing this process with much more intention in protecting wildlife. Now, rather than considering euthanizing oiled wildlife, companies are spending thousands to clean just one bird. This session will help prepare us so we know what regulatory expectations are and know how to prepare before we have a spill and what to do in case we have a spill. Our speaker today is Dan Webster. Dan is a biologist with 25 years experience who has been providing assistance with spill response since the late 1990s. He is an owner at EcoWeb Ecological Consulting and is providing wildlife expertise in Northeast BC and Alberta. I'd like to thank Dan for his willingness to present to us today, and we'll turn the screen over to him now.
All right, thanks, Carl. I'm going to first tackle the sharing of the screen. Okay, so emergency wildlife response on BC spills. This is a topic I have shared a lot on throughout Alberta. As a professional biologist, as Carl was saying, I've been doing this for about 25 years. I've been working on spills for about 20 of those. And initially, I spent a lot of my time, as most of you, working on the containment and recovery aspects. Back in 2011, the question was put to me, what can we do for wildlife on spill sites? The Alberta regulators had come up with a series of guidelines that they wanted covered off on spills. And so I was brought in because of my familiarity with spills to do the wildlife response on inland spills. And initially, most animals, we were able to deter a lot of animals out of the sites once we got some deterrents up. But if we captured an animal, it was typically euthanized. There was not a lot of action beyond that. So this seemed to me and a lot of others to be not good enough. There was a lot of information internationally about handling oiled wildlife on ocean-based spills. And so we began to look into developing advanced deterrent and hazing methods, as well as live trapping wildlife on oil spills so that we could rehabilitate, as well as euthanize the ones that we couldn't save. So we worked quite closely with regulators, international experts, veterinarians, and a lot of the wildlife rehabilitation organizations throughout BC and Alberta, and developed a series of protocols for oiled wildlife capture and handling, field stabilization, and transportation in order to support the ability to rehabilitate oiled wildlife. So that's what this presentation is going to focus on. Our topics today, we're going to start on wildlife response and where it fits into the incident command system. We all know that the incident command system is the basis for how we control our releases. So I'm going to give you a bit of information on where we fit in there, why wildlife response is important and required, our initial wildlife response activities, what do we do at the beginning. I'm going to cover wildlife assessment, and this is an area that's often overlooked or not done as sufficiently as it should be. So we're going to cover that in a little bit of detail. I'm going to go into what should be in a wildlife management plan, because we use these wildlife management plan in order to get our permits. So it's imperative that it has all the required information. We'll talk about implementation of a wildlife management plan. This is going to get into our deterrence and hazing, our environmental monitoring, and potentially research. And depending on the spill, it may get into capture, stabilization, and transport of impacted wildlife for rehabilitation. We're also going to touch on post-spill monitoring and assessment, because this has become more of an ask these days from regulators as we're moving forward. So The incident command system. Everybody here is probably familiar in one way, shape, or form with how ICS works. I'm sure a lot of you are within the ICS group in your company or agency. So I think everybody knows that the environmental aspect falls under planning, but in our minds, this falls under planning for developing our management plans, getting our permits, assessing what wildlife are in the area. But it's not just in planning. If there are impacted wildlife or wildlife that are going to be impacted potentially by the release, then we have to form a wildlife branch within our operations section. And which makes a lot of sense because operations is where people do, right? So our wildlife branch, they're going to be involved in setting up the deterrence, hazing, monitoring wildlife movements, recovery and transport, stabilization and rehabilitation. So if we are into an incident where wildlife are being impacted, expect to see a wildlife branch within your ICS structure. So a big question, why do we do wildlife response? The first answer I can give you is because of regulatory requirements, the legal aspect. We have a number of both federal and provincial legislation in place that requires us to look after wildlife. Federally, we have the Wildlife Act, Species at Risk Act, Migratory Bird Convention Act, the Fisheries Act, all of which are pretty heavy-hitting chunks of legislation. Provincially here in British Columbia, we have the Environmental Management Act, which has our spill preparedness, response and recovery regulation, contingency planning regulation, and our reporting. There's also the Oil and Gas Activities Act and regulations, and I'm going to get to the difference here between these two, because for a lot of oil and gas operators, there's a bit of a different system there. So I'll get into that in a little bit here. We also have the Provincial Wildlife Act. In the province, the only people that are authorized to touch or hold wildlife without a permit in some way, shape, or form are wildlife officers of the government. So as public, we have to either have a hunting license, a trapping license, and similarly on spills, we have to have a permit in place to be able to touch wildlife. So the spill contingency planning regulation, this is where we are looking at transportation groups and movement of hydrocarbons across the province. So they have quite a bit of detail on procedures that must be in place to deter wildlife from your spill site, reducing attractants to wildlife at your spill site, and reducing the presence. They make it fairly clear we have to manage the access to the site and keep wildlife out. They also, in their planning, want you to identify potential site where wildlife could be present and where this would create a problem, and identify relevant expertise that could be called on to assist with tending to wildlife in the event of a spill. So where the exemption comes in place here is when we're dealing with the Oil and Gas Commission. So if you are an OGC regulated company, you are exempt from Section 91.11 of the Environmental Management Act because you are regulated under the Oil and Gas Activities Act and the Emergency Management Regulation. So I guess that's one of the things that might seem confusing about that. It's like, oh, well, I don't have to do any of that. Well, no, you're just regulated by the Oil and Gas Commission. So you're exempt from the Ministry of Environment's preparedness requirements for spill contingency planning and testing spill contingency plans and record keeping, but you are still subject to the OGC's requirements for these. And this is because in the province of BC, the process of oil and gas is regulated by one agency so that it's more efficient that way. So the OGC, in their emergency response plan requirements, follows CSA Z 246.2-18, emergency preparedness and response for petroleum and natural gas industry systems. So this includes a number of measures for protecting the environment, and as you read through it, I didn't find it as specific in discussing wildlife measures. However, our incident experience shows us that these are still key considerations. It's not that these don't have to be addressed, the wording is just slightly different. So as we move forward in this discussion, we're going to be looking at all of the things that must be done in the planning for wildlife fauna response. So that's just a bit of a legislative difference there. So it's not just legal requirements why we do wildlife response. As Carl was discussing, more and more, this is a public persona issue. There is the issue of social license, which is considered to exist when the perceptions, opinions, and beliefs held by the population regarding your development and its approval are held in place. So social license takes a very long time. It builds up very slowly, but it can be lost very quickly, particularly when we see media images of oiled wildlife, as we've seen in the last 10 years. In order for industry to obtain a social license to transport oil, they have to show they're taking responsibility for oiled wildlife. So this goes deep into the public perception. The public has basically said there's no excuse for not having an adequate response to address oiled wildlife if you're going to be transporting oil in BC. And of course, everybody knows politics, and I think this has been driven home quite a lot in the last few years. Lobby groups, both within and out external to Canada, have prevented major projects from going ahead because there's a lack of trust, a lack of trust that this project is going to have impacts on the environment. So it's beholden upon producers to have good plans in place and respond adequately in the event of a spill when it comes to wildlife response. So our initial wildlife response, we have a spill. Now, what do we do? Anybody that has been on a spill knows that the first 24 hours are crucial. And so as you're heading out there as the first responder, you're going to have to start the wildlife response. That's going to be up to you. So some of the things that you should be having in the back of your mind is the spill into a water course. This is very important. Or is it sensitive habitat? Are there currently impacted wildlife there, or wildlife that are at risk of being impacted? As we put these plans together, a lot of companies have existing plans in place and equipment. The WCSS spill co-ops in particular have stockpiles of equipment that is available for your spill response, which includes a wildlife trailer. Wildlife responders just need a lot of information to develop a wildlife response plan. Where's the spill? What habitats are affected? If it is into water, what is it connected to? How big is the area affected? Can we access it quickly and safely without causing a large impact? Are there impacted animals? What species are affected? How many? Where are they now? What product was spilled and how much? How long has it been in the environment? Is it weathered or is it on the surface? What effect does it have on wildlife? Does it pose a risk to responders? And how can it be cleaned from animals? We need to know what is currently being done, what equipment is available, and how many people are on site. So this is a big ask. So when you're into your spill and you're making that phone call to a professional wildlife responder, be prepared to have somebody set up to answer some of these questions. So if there is a potential risk to animals that are to be impacted by a spill, it is very important to have a qualified wildlife responder on your site. Wildlife responders are professionals. They can identify potential animal species that are affected in the area, determine what habitats and what habitats use is in the area, what best practices would be to minimize impacts to the animal, locating and handling of animals within an impacted area, and most importantly, establishing the risk to wildlife so we know how we're going to move forward. So wildlife assessment. During our initial assessment, we find a lot of impact that is difficult to notice and likely hasn't been noticed by the other responders. Impacted animals tend to hide, or they're stuck in the product and not identifiable. You can see some of the pictures here. I know they're a little bit graphic, but this is what we see typically on an oil spill. There are initial mortalities that occur, and they're hidden in the product. It's all about determining the risk to wildlife, both immediately and in the longer term. I can't stress enough the importance of having qualified people to perform the initial wildlife assessment. They should be familiar with potential habitat for all the species and able to identify not only the species from their sign, but from the habitat that they're using. It's also imperative that the response team is familiar with wildlife behavior, as this will assist with identifying potential impacted species and help to determine where they may be hiding. We need to know what is impacted now and what may become impacted before the spill can be cleaned up. All of this feeds into and should be the basis of our wildlife management plan. This is the plan where we determine how we're going to protect wildlife, what hazing and deterrence methods we're going to use, whether we need to implement capture and recovery, stabilization and transport, and if it's required, rehabilitation. So the wildlife management plan. This plan is often overlooked. However, it is a very important document and requires that you have a look at the spill in terms of risk to wildlife, be able to assess the habitat types, and complete all the background searches for wildlife data in the area, such as species at risk. It's also a great time to contact the local fish and wildlife biologists to determine if there's anything specific that we need to be aware of, or if they have any specific requirements for the area that your spill occurred in. So the response team at this point is going to figure out the highest risk to wildlife, which may not be the highest level of contamination. So, for example, if you have a low level of contamination, but it's in excellent habitat that's full of animals, this may create more risk to wildlife than your higher contaminated areas. So our wildlife management plan, it's going to go into the spill details and actions, the environmental setting, what our objectives are, what are we trying to accomplish in this plan. It's going to have an exposure reduction plan. So exposure reduction plan, this is where we're reducing the risk of animals coming in contact with oil. Part of this is going to be our deterrent and hazing plan, how we're going to keep animals out of our product. We're also, if we're dealing with animals that could be mobile and get into our spill site, we're going to have to look at wildlife recovery. And if we're recovering, we're not only going to have to look at rehabilitation protocols, but also potentially euthanization. We're going to have to set up wildlife monitoring. We can't simply put up deterrents and expect that animals are just going to be scared of the scary face that you put out there or the effigies that you put up. That's not how animals work. They're tricky. They will find a way around what you've put in place and get themselves into trouble. Wildlife mortalities are an important component here, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on. I think it often is another thing that's overlooked, but it's part of our recovery of our product is to recover product that has killed animals already. So our permits are obtained based on this plan. So in BC, there are several permits that are required. In general, we are getting a general wildlife permit. This allows, there's no specific oil spill wildlife permit. So the closest thing is our general wildlife permit, and this covers off our capture, possession of wildlife, transportation of wildlife, and is also going to allow us to trap wildlife. Some examples of this are the fish salvage permits, if fish are a big concern, and as well amphibian and other animal capture and relocation. A big component of being able to put this in place is filling out the animal care form and the objectives of the animal care. We have a lot of requirements when we're capturing animals and handling animals that we're not going to cause them undue harm. And over top of this, and I kind of graded out in the slide, is a wildlife rehabilitator's permit. This is long-term and based on a qualified facility. So this is not something you're likely going to get on your spill, but it is likely that you're going to have to engage an existing wildlife rehab center so that we can access facilities where we can conduct rehabilitation. There are also federal permits that come into play under the Wildlife Act and the Migratory Bird Convention Act through Environment and Climate Change Canada. On a lot of spills, if the provincial regulator has put a permit in place, often Environment Canada will not put another permit in place on top of them. But for example, I have a yearly permit that I get for handling oiled migratory birds. And this is to deal with the one-offs on oil and gas sites where there may have been an animal that has become impacted by your operations. So that's also something to consider in the long term. If this is a big risk, that you may want to look forward to having some of these yearly permits in place. But specifically, we're talking about our permitting in British Columbia, and unfortunately, a general wildlife permit can take 2 to 6 months to put in place. There are a number of requirements for consultation with First Nations. There's a lot of things that have to be considered in order for the province to issue a general wildlife permit. So anybody who's been on spill response knows full well that 2 to 6 months is not generally going to work for you. So what are my options? General wildlife permits can be issued to an environmental emergency response officer with the Ministry of Environment by the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, the Wildlife Branch. They can directly issue those permits to an emergency response officer because they are government officers and they can authorize them to handle wildlife. And then that emergency response officer can delegate the authority of the operation of that permit to your professional wildlife responder team. There's also the one-offs, temporary emergency situations. And I know a lot of times operators will contact the BC Conservation Officer Service or even the emergency response officer if they have a small spill, and they can get a verbal authorization to capture impacted animals. And I'm going to get into that and some of my thoughts around that as we go forward here. But that is possible if you are dealing with a one-off. But if you are dealing with a larger spill situation, you're likely going to need to get that general wildlife permit. Okay, so what can I do without a permit? I just want to note here one important thing. The WCSS wildlife trailers contain both deterrents and hazing supplies, so you need to know what you can use based upon your approval. If you don't have a permit, then you should not be using those hazing supplies because those are something you need a permit to use. So some of the things I can do, I can put up wildlife fencing, the perimeter fencing, amphibian fencing to keep wildlife out of my spill area. This is something I can get started on in discussion with the emergency response officers, especially if there's clearing that needs to take place to keep wildlife out of our spill area. We can start placing deterrents, not active hazing, but just the normal deterrents. We can have the presence of humans and equipment that will keep animals out of the area. And typically around the main part of our spill area, this is going to be something that's there anyways. We can conduct our field survey to determine what animals are in the area and whether they're potentially impacted. And this is where we can begin our monitoring and start developing our research program for how we're going to identify what animals are being impacted or if animals are being impacted. We can establish our safety documentation, and we can order and organize equipment and supplies for the response. So actions allowed with a permit. This is where we're going to get into hazing. And I'm going to get on in the next few slides about what the difference is between deterrence and hazing. So I'll clear that up here. We can also begin our research programs, which may involve some capture. And we can start animal trapping, stabilizing animals, relocating unaffected animals, and or treatment and rehabilitation of impacted animals. So deterrents. Deterrents are passive systems that prevent animals from entering your impacted area. Deterrents include acoustic repellents, so you might have the predator or distress call that will scare some animals away. Zon cannons I put on here as a deterrent. Now, I'm going to caveat that based upon what habitat you're in. If you are in a prime breeding habitat for a migratory bird or a species at risk, then you're probably going to want to have your permit in place before you start setting off Zon cannons. But if you're in just general regular habitat and there's no sensitive habitat near there, Zon cannons can help to distance wildlife from your spill area. Boundary repellents, that's your barriers and fences. Visual repellents, flagging, lights, balloons, reflective tape, predator decoys, and my favorite, the wavy man. I'll go into some of that. So deterrents are being passive. I'll just give you a few examples here, because there are species and site specific. For example, the hawk kite. It is useful in keeping small birds and mammals out of the area. It also must be free flying. I have come onto spill sites and seen the hawk stapled to a fence post, which is not very lifelike. One of the benefits of the hawk kites is that they move around and they represent a hawk active in the area, which will keep the smaller birds and mammals out of there. Pennant flagging, what it is useful for is when you have overflying migrant waterfowl that are looking to land on a nice chunk of oiled up water. It can break up the visual aspect of their ability to land on that water and prevent them from landing. Now, maybe prevent them. There's nothing foolproof. I've seen ducks actually dive bomb the netting on engineered containment systems and get through. So nothing is 100%, but it does help. The wavy men, where we found these especially useful was if we had diving ducks. We had tried to keep some of the ducks away from our spill area using remote control boats. And as you run a remote control boat toward a diving duck, he just simply dives and comes up. And the risk there is that he's going to come up within the oiled area. But with this constant presence of this wavy man there, they do keep their distance and they tend to stay away from your product, which is useful. Another thing too we can do is set up decoys. We can place attractants using duck decoys and put them on a clean pond in the area to try and attract migrating birds to land there as opposed to our inhospitable spill area. So hazing are active systems to remove an animal from an impacted area. So again, there's going to be an acoustic component, but they're going to be much more invasive. We're looking at the radio-controlled Zon cannons, the explosives. This is for constant repetition of noise, and it is likely being stationed to keep animals out of a breeding area that they want to be in. So it is much more regular and loud, and it creates a lot of disturbance. Visual repellents, we get into our radar-activated laser systems. We see these up on the oil sands. Non-capture methods, horns, bear bangers, helicopters, airboats, ATVs. These can all be active hazing systems. What deterring and hazing does not include is animal capture methods. So I guess the best way to provide a picture in your head of the difference between deterrent and hazing is I'll just start with a little story here. This picture where you can see the helicopter, and those aren't giant horseflies. They're actually regular sized horseflies. They're just very close. But the helicopter approaching the bison, we had a pipeline break and we were dealing with about 36% H2S in that pipeline. So the day we were doing our repair on the pipeline and we'd exposed it and we were cutting it open, this group of bison decided that they were going to walk down the right of way right to where we were working on the pipeline. So of course, we got called in. We came in on the ground and through air horns and vehicles tried to turn them around. But the bison were very sure in their minds they wanted to head up the pipeline right away, the exact direction we didn't want them to go. So I got on the horn and got a hold of the chopper pilot, and he came and landed on a nearby well site, and we got up in the air. And the pilot was a good New Zealand boy who'd done a bunch of flying and moving of animals with helicopters in the past. So we were able to get in and slowly turn that herd of bison around with the helicopter and allow them to go the other way up the right of way to a safer area where there wasn't potential of H2S and bad headlines in the press. So a fairly extreme example of hazing, but also effective. So one of the things that we need to consider if we have wildlife on our spill sites is that we have to have qualified wildlife monitors there to determine what the ongoing impacts to wildlife are, where animals are moving, if there's new species moving in, if they're acclimating to deterrents. Deterrents, when once placed, can't remain stagnant. Animals quickly get used to deterrents and will start ignoring them quite quickly, so they often have to be moved. So our monitoring is very important. It forms a basis for where we're going to focus our deterrence, what we're going to change it to, and if that active hazing of animals to keep them out of a hotspot needs to occur. It also provides daily reports and documentation the regulators are going to need down the line. So while we're there, we're gathering a lot of information. So wildlife monitors also present an opportunity to collect data on the species in the area, the habitats, the effects of the spill. And all of this is going to go towards your final report on the effects of the incident. Okay, so once we have for sure hit the point where we have oiled wildlife on our spill, this is where we're going to hit our triggers for wildlife capture. So wildlife capture takes place once we have wildlife that are being impacted or likely to be impacted immediately by the release. Typically, if we have a release of contaminants into a watercourse, river, pond, or wetland, or the releases within a migratory corridor during the migration season, these all create an enhanced risk to wildlife. What I really want to drive home here, though, is once you start capture, you have to be set up for all of the other items. You can't just start capture and have, figure out your stabilization, assessment, and transportation as you go. So all of these things feed into each other, and this is why this needs to be put place into your wildlife management plan before you even get started with capture. So this is a flowchart system where we move from capture, we stabilize the animals, we assess them, and at this point, we're going to have a veterinarian involved, and I forgot to mention that earlier, but in our wildlife management plan, if wildlife capture is something we're considering, we do have to have the input of a veterinarian with experience with wildlife. And so we're going to perform an assessment on whether we're going to be either euthanizing that animal or attempting rehabilitation. So once that assessment has taken place, the animal is then transported for treatment and rehabilitation, and hopefully after that for release back into the environment. So wildlife recovery uses a variety of capture and trapping methods. Pictured here, you can see a Hancock trap. It's a clamshell style trap used for catching beavers. We employ a lot of different trap systems. The little barge you see there is actually has a little trap door where ducks would walk up onto there, and the trap door would fling open and they'd go into a box below the floating dock so that we can capture ducks. There's a lot to this, and we learn so much on every spill. Every spill we get better at this. In order to develop a lot of these techniques, we did bring in some of the international experts, some of the people who'd worked on spills on the ocean and integrated their techniques into our capture methods. But even to this day, we'll use a simple fishing net to capture some animals. So in order for this to take place, though, our permits have to be in place and capture has to be led by qualified professionals. Now, the question always comes up, what about opportunistic rescue? So this is where, your first day of the spill, there's one oiled duck and he's right there. It's usually not advised, but if it's safe to do so, and if the animal is stationary and definitely impacted, we can have other staff secure that animal, and we just have to make sure we have some way of containing it. So, for example, the WCSS wildlife trailers has a variety of cages within it. That may be adequate containment. If you have nothing but a box, just make sure you cut some holes in it. And also make sure it's something that's not going to escape. Animals don't really get that we're trying to help them, and they will try and escape. They will try and bite at you and scratch at you. So just be aware of that if you're putting yourself between a wild animal and capture. Now, deceased wildlife. This is we have to collect all dead oil-impacted wildlife to prevent secondary contamination by scavengers or predators. So when we're out there cleaning up a spill, we are there to clean up all the oil. And if it happens to be on a dead animal or duck, then we also have to collect that. Now, the regulators will also have some stipulations on this. Dead wildlife can be used as evidence, so they're going to want it to be collected in a controlled fashion. Our typical protocol is to wrap it in tinfoil, put it in a paper bag, and then contain that whole package in a Ziploc bag and fill out a chain of custody, which is your who, what, where, and when. Stabilization. Animals are very stressed during and after capture. They don't understand that we're trying to help them. And so we want to get them stabilized as quickly as possible. So typically we have 3 objectives. We want to regulate their temperature, we want to get them hydrated, and we want to apply appropriate medication. In most circumstances, without trained personnel on site or veterinarian trained personnel on site, regulating the temperature may be as good as we can do. To rehydrate, we can't just give them a water dish. Please don't do that. We have to actually run a tube down their neck and apply hydration that way. So appropriate medication, again, you have to know what you're giving and what effects that might have. So we need the input of a veterinarian, and we need qualified personnel. If we have high volumes of animals, we're going to need a triage system. We need to assess which ones we can care for, which ones we need to euthanize and put out of their misery. So if field stabilization is unavailable, we don't have a veterinarian on site, we don't have the qualified personnel, we're likely going to move quickly to transportation if we have somewhere to take them. So transportation, again, is covered off under our general wildlife permit. The distance to primary care facilities is considerable when we're up in Northeast BC because we do not have any up in Northeast BC. We have some veterinarian clinics. They are not wildlife rehabilitation centers. They do not have the appropriate permits to rehabilitate wildlife. We may be able to get an approval for them to temporarily handle 1 or 2 animals, but they are not primary care facilities. So the type of animal will also dictate transportation containers. Up in this area, typically I'm flying stuff down to some organizations down in the Lower Mainland that can help me out. And so that has to all be worked out ahead of time. You can't just simply show up at the airport with a beaver in a cage and ship it off to Burnaby. So there's a little bit of work that needs to go on ahead of that. Now, for treatment and rehabilitation in British Columbia, I've just listed a few of the ones here that I've worked with: the Wildlife Rescue Association, the Old Wildlife Society of BC, and I've put a link here to the Wildlife Rehabilitators Network of BC. So some of these have experience dealing with old wildlife. Alberta has a number of facilities that we've worked with over the years that have built up some capacity to deal with old wildlife. I've listed a few of them here, but it's important to note that you have to have approval from the regulators for interprovincial movement of wildlife, because the wildlife is owned by the province under the Provincial Act, not federally. So interprovincial movement of wildlife is something that requires approval, and you may be able to get it, but it's not going to be as easy as you think. So this always begs the question, why do we not have a facility to handle oiled wildlife? The pictures along the bottom here are from some of the facilities down in California. They are dealing with large oil releases off in the ocean, so they have some pretty nice facilities there for rehabilitating birds. The picture in the upper right is of a mobile oiled wildlife response unit, which would be ideal, I think, for BC and Alberta. We just currently don't have this in place. There's been talk of it over the years, and I don't know where it's sitting right now. I haven't heard that this is in place. I've heard various rumors that they might be coming in place, but until we have something like this that we can mobilize out to a major center and bring our oiled wildlife to, we're going to be setting up temporary systems, and that's not ideal, and it's going to be a big problem if you have a large incident where a lot of wildlife are impacted. So post-spill, in some cases, spill cleanup may not be able to be completed in a single season. So, or the risk to wildlife might extend beyond the initial spill year. So we have to set up our monitoring and research. So if we're doing wildlife monitoring throughout the course of our spill within one season, it's good to have it so that that can be replicated in the future years. So we can look at whether there was population level effects, whether the habitat is recovering, if the use of the habitat is the same before and after the spill. One example I have is we looked at red-winged blackbird eggshell thickness to determine if there was any toxic elements still out in the environment. What we found is there was fewer red-winged blackbirds within the spill area, but their eggshell thickness was exactly the same as that offsite. So then we were wondering, well, why are there fewer in there? What it came down to in the end is a lack of invertebrates and bugs. We had lowered the food supply because we had drained out the marshland, and that had killed a lot of the food supply. So a lot of the males, when they're setting up their mating territory, were simply not developing nests within the spill area because it wasn't as good for foraging. So there's a lot of other effects that can happen from a spill, and there's more and more the requirement to study this before and after is being asked of us by the regulators. So in quick summary here, wildlife response is definitely key as part of your spill response. If you are in any sort of water course or wetland habitat, I almost guarantee you're going to impact wildlife. Wildlife response fits into the operations and planning sections of incident command. Wildlife response is necessary not just for legal requirements, but also our social license and public perception. As an initial responder on a spill, you must start the initial wildlife response. So this is going to be contacting a professional wildlife responder if it's going to involve multiple animals, setting up deterrents, and noting any impacted animals in the area. You're going to need to conduct a thorough wildlife assessment, which will describe all the habitats in the spill area, the species using the area, and if wildlife is being or may be impacted by the spill. So the main components of a wildlife management plan include an exposure reduction plan, how we're going to keep animals out of the oil, our deterrent and hazing plan, wildlife recovery, oiled wildlife rehabilitation, because as we saw, there's a lot of steps to account for there if you are going to rehabilitate wildlife, our wildlife monitoring, and how we're going to address wildlife mortalities and recovery. Required permits in BC include a general wildlife permit, fish salvage scientific collection permit, animal care and handling approval. The implementation of our wildlife management plan is going to involve deterrents and hazing placement, monitoring, capturing, stabilization, and transport of impacted wildlife. I'm now just going to open it up for the questions, if we had any here.
Dan, I'm just going to add a question in here. Would a person need to get a permit through Environment Canada if they already have a provincial permit?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And actually, it's one that even the regulators seem to have questions on. The general answer I can give you from being on some of the major spills is no. The provincial permit will cover you. However, Environment Canada is going to ask that they be included in all the correspondence there. And again, I say that that is not a firm answer because Environment Canada could decide that they don't agree with the provincial permit, the conditions don't match what their objectives are, and so they may request that you get a permit anyways. So it is something that's going to be worked out during your spill. In your incident command discussions, you're likely going to have that conversation with Environment Canada. Most of the time, though, you're going to be good with a provincial permit. So it would only be in the case of a major release where that would be a problem. Okay, so we have a question here. Has the wildlife process been added to North River Midstream's ERP? That's a question. I might have to turn that one over to Carl. Oh, I don't know if he has it.
I'm on now, so no, I'll have to follow up on that one. If
Okay.
whoever asked that one can get back to me later. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, and I have another question here. Can you speak to wildlife exposure to norms found in some cuttings and used equipment and best practice to prevent it? That is an excellent question. I don't know that that's necessarily been addressed. Again, I think anytime you're dealing with contamination, you should have measures, and you have open contamination, the requirement to keep wildlife out of and away from known contamination would apply. So that's a little bit of an interpretation, but I would say yes, you should, if you have brought stuff to surface, you should have a method of keeping animals out of there if it is a potential harm to them. Okay, I see Shannon has put up the YouTube link there to the presentation. So if you want to go through this again and review it, or review it with some of your personnel, by all means. And I just throw out there as well that if there are any questions, I'm available to answer any of those at any time. My contact information was in the slide presentation here, and I'm sure Shannon will distribute that as well. So we've run into a lot of really odd circumstances over the years when it comes to wildlife response, and yeah, there's every time I think there's not going to be something new, there is. So yeah, if you run into an odd problem, feel free to ask the question. We'll be more than happy to answer that for you.
Okay, it's Shannon Gerald here. I didn't actually introduce myself at the beginning. So I'm just going to present now. Hello. First of all, thank you all for joining us. I really do appreciate you doing that. And for those of you who aren't aware, WCSS is primarily volunteer-based. So Carl Reimer in Fort St. John and Don Brown in Fort Nelson they lead our steering committee in Area C in the initiatives that WCSS takes. So they take issues in Northeast BC and they bring them to WCSS so that we can plan accordingly. We're not a response organization, in case you weren't aware. We have 7 staff and many, many volunteers. So we manage your equipment and we provide training. And in light of what's going on, we are adapting to different modes of communication. So I'm actually just going to put up a poll, and I'd like to know what you guys think. Would you like to see more webinars? And if so, what type of topics are you interested in? So that should just be showing up on your screen right now. And I'll just give you a few moments to read through that. Okay, so I'll just end it here. Thank you very much, guys. That was really helpful. Apparently webinars are a good way to go. I'm just gonna share that with you guys. So you all said yes, we'd like to see more webinars. Popular vote was for winter containment and recovery, so that's great, but you all seemed very interested in all other topics as well. So that's great feedback. Thank you very much. So just a little bit further, Dan is an example of a subject matter expert that we keep on hand as a part of our resource list. So if we found that a member company really didn't know what to do, we could connect you to Dan. But I hope that this will be some kind of an opportunity for you to review your own contractor list, go to your oil spill contingency manual or your emergency response plan, and just make sure that that information is updated. Again, Dan's information will be at the beginning of this presentation. It is available on YouTube, it will be available on YouTube, so you can capture it there. But if you're not sure, just please do get in touch with me. I'm going to show you just right now how to access your equipment on our website. So it's wcss.ab.ca, and it's very simple. You just go over to equipment, and you can get a live equipment report. And right here, it's interactive, so you can click right on Fort St. John, Area C, and you'll see Fort Nelson and Fort St. John. You'll see you've got a wildlife unit right there in Fort St. John. So you also have a boom cache, which is great. You've just got a lot of extra equipment there. So if you need to contact anyone from WCSS, our headquarters are all here. And there's pictures of all of us. Here we are. I won't get into it too detailed, but really I do recommend having a look through our website. It's a great resource. And so finally, I would really just like to thank Dan for his presentation, and I'd also like to thank Carl and Dawn and our steering committee for making this possible, and for all of you for joining us. So with that, I will be, I see we have just one more question here. Oh, thank you for the great presentation. Yes, thank you very much. So we will let you go, and please do get in touch if you have any questions. Okay, thanks everyone.